The wind howled through the pines like a wounded animal, and the gray sky pressed low over the rugged Wyoming landscape. Snow had begun falling earlier than expected that year, first lightly, then with a ferocity that even the oldest trappers in the region had rarely seen. It was the winter of 1873, and Clara Wilkins found herself far from everything she had ever known, trying to build a life with the man she loved on the edge of the untamed. West. Clara had married John Wilkins the previous spring. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man with calloused hands and a dream in his eyes. They met in St. Louis, where Clara had worked as a seamstress and John had been gathering supplies to head west. He spoke of open skies, rich soil, and the kind of independence only a man carving out his place in the wilderness could know. Clara, orphaned young and raised by distant relatives, saw in him not just a husband, but the promise of a future that was hers to choose. They married quickly and set out soon after. Following the call of the frontier, they settled in a small log cabin John built himself near the Wind River Range, far from the nearest town. It was rough living, hauling water, chopping wood, hunting game, but Clara took to it with a quiet resilience. She learned to cook over an open fire, mend worn clothes with thread made from sinew, and shoot well enough to protect herself from wolves or worse. By October, they had stockpiled food, stacked firewood high against the cabin wall, and felt prepared to face the winter. But the winter came too early. In mid-November, before the rivers had fully iced over and before the deer had finished their seasonal migration, a brutal blizzard swept in from the north. Snow fell for 5 days straight, burying their cabin up to the windows. Temperatures plunged well below zero, freezing their well and making it dangerous to even step outside. The food they'd stored began to dwindle more quickly than expected. Game was scarce. Their small flock of chickens froze in the coop. The roof groaned under the weight of the snow. Each night, Clara lay curled beside John in their small bed, listening to the wind scream and feeling the cold creeping in around the edges of their world. John tried to keep Clara's spirits up with stories and soft humor, but she could see the worry in his eyes. On the 12th day of snow, he confessed, "They didn't have enough firewood or food to last another 2 weeks. We've got to get to town," he said, wrapping a wool scarf around his neck. "If I leave at first light and keep to the river trail, I can make it to Fort Washakie in 3 days. I'll bring back supplies." Clara begged him not to go. The snow was too deep. The wind was too sharp. But John was determined. "You'll be safe here. Just keep the fire going. I'll be back by week's end." Before dawn, John kissed her goodbye, wrapped in every piece of clothing they owned, and stepped into the pale blue morning. Clara watched him disappear into the snow, his form swallowed by the white landscape. The door shut with a thud that echoed like finality in the tiny cabin. The first day passed with Clara huddled near the fire, rationing the last of their food. The second day, she began to burn the furniture. On the third day, the storm returned, and with it came fear. John should have reached the fort by now, or sent someone, or anything. By the 5th day, Clara stopped counting the hours. She barely ate, only stirred to stoke the flames or listen for footsteps in the snow. But no footsteps came. Outside, the wilderness pressed in. Inside, loneliness began to settle like frost. She wrapped herself in John's coat, breathing in his scent, holding on to a hope that was melting like ice against a fire. She didn't know it yet, but her journey was just beginning. The storm lasted for 3 more days. Clara sat in near silence. The only sounds the crackling of the fire and the relentless wind outside. Each gust beat against the cabin walls like a warning. The once strong logs of the cabin, so reassuring when she and John first built them, now seemed fragile like the bones of a body pushed too far. She hadn't slept properly in days. Hunger gnawed at her belly, but fear gnawed deeper. She imagined John, strong and stubborn, pushing through snowdrifts up to his chest, fighting toward Fort Washakie. She told herself he was delayed, maybe helping someone else, maybe stuck waiting out the storm in some trapper's shack or army outpost. But when the storm broke, the silence that followed felt too complete. Too empty. She stepped outside into the bitter light of morning. The snow was waist-deep and glittered in the sun like shards of broken glass. Her legs ached as she pushed through the drifts, calling John's name even though she knew there would be no answer. Clara returned to the cabin. That night, she burned the last of the kindling and tore apart a wooden stool to keep the fire alive. The next morning, she made a choice. If John was still out there, he might be alive, but not for much longer. If he had died, she needed to know. She packed a small satchel, 2 biscuits, a water skin with melted snow, and the last candle stub. She wrapped herself in every layer she had, including John's heavy wool coat, which still held the shape of his shoulders and the faintest scent of pine smoke and leather. She tied the sleeves of another coat around her boots as makeshift snow gaiters and set out along the river trail, the path John had taken 5 days earlier. The world was white, silent and merciless. The cold pierced her clothing within minutes, but she kept going, one slow step at a time, following the frozen creek's meandering line. She stumbled more than once, her legs giving out from exhaustion or ice hidden beneath the snow. Still, she pressed on, fueled not by hope but by love and dread. It was nearly midday when she saw it, a dark shape ahead, half buried in a snowbank beneath a broken pine tree. Her heart stopped. No, she whispered, but her legs moved faster. As she got closer, the shape resolved into something unmistakable. The familiar form of a man, huddled and still, arms wrapped around himself as though trying to fight the cold. To the very end. John. Clara dropped to her knees beside him. His skin was blue, eyes half closed beneath a layer of ice. His hands were stiff, clutched to his chest. There was no movement, no breath, no life. She didn't scream. There was no one to hear her. No point. Instead, she wrapped her arms around his frozen body and held him, pressing her forehead to his. A part of her expected the warmth of her tears might wake him, but there were no tears. Just silence and snow and a stillness that cut deeper than cold ever could. Hours later, she returned to the cabin, numb in body and soul. She didn't remember the walk back. Inside, she placed John's wedding ring on the table beside the bed and lay down, still wearing his coat. The fire had gone out and there was nothing left to burn. She lay curled on the bed, waiting for sleep to take her to wherever John had gone. But death, it seemed, was not coming for her just yet. The next morning brought not only bitter cold, but something else: footsteps in the snow. She didn't know it yet, but help was on its way. The cabin was quieter than it had ever been. John had always filled the space with sound, his boots on the floorboards, his humming while chopping wood, his laughter rising from some memory he just recalled. But now there was only the moan of the wind and the ticking in Clara's head. The sound of absence. She moved like a shadow. The fire was gone. She had nothing left to feed it. She slept in her clothes, curled tightly in the corner of the bed beneath the bearskin John had trapped last fall. She didn't cry. There was no energy left for crying. Sometimes she spoke aloud, only to hear a voice break the silence. "John?" She'd whisper into the dark, though she didn't expect a response. Days passed, or maybe just hours. Time lost its shape without light or warmth to mark its rhythm. Hunger was constant but dull now, like the memory of a wound instead of its bleeding edge. Snow had drifted in under the door. She didn't bother sweeping it away. She had one candle left. She didn't light it, not yet. It felt sacred somehow, a final bit of hope she wasn't ready to burn. She kept it beside her, like a relic of civilization. On what might have been the 5th day, Clara heard something strange, a soft crunch in the snow outside the cabin. Her body tensed. Her first thought was a wolf, or a bear, or something worse. But animals rarely made deliberate-sounding footsteps like that. She reached for the rifle John had left propped beside the door unloaded. She knew, but it gave her a sense of control. Then came a knock. A gentle, rhythmic knock. Not the angry pounding of danger, but the cautious touch of someone unsure whether they were welcome. Clara opened the door only a crack. The sunlight was blinding. Outside stood three people bundled in furs, faces darkened. With wind and sun, their hair braided and adorned with feathers and beads. Two were older, one man and one woman, and between them stood a younger man, perhaps not much older than Clara. He held out a bundle wrapped in hide. At first, Clara could only blink. The woman stepped forward slowly and placed the bundle in Clara's arms. It was warm, food, cooked meat and something wrapped in cloth that smelled like cornbread. Clara's fingers trembled. She wanted to speak, but the words lodged in her throat. The people did not speak English, at least, not more than a word or two, but their eyes were kind. Their presence was calm, certain, as though they had expected to find her. The older man pointed to the woods behind him and then at the cabin, raising his eyebrows, asking a silent question. Was she alone? Clara nodded once. The younger man glanced past her shoulder into the dim cabin, and something changed in his expression. Not pity, not fear, but understanding. They didn't press her with questions. They didn't enter. Instead, they made a fire outside, not 10 feet from her door, and gestured for her to come warm herself. Clara hesitated only a moment, then stepped out, cradling the food like it might vanish if she looked away. She sat beside them. The fire was real, hot, alive. She could feel her fingers again. They shared more food, spoke to each other in soft Shoshone words she didn't understand, but somehow she didn't feel excluded. One of the women handed her a blanket woven with dark red and cream colors. Another gave her a flat piece of birch bark painted with symbols. Clara didn't know what it meant, but it felt like a gift, a gesture of connection. As the sun dipped lower, the group stood to leave. The young man lingered behind, looking at Clara once more. He said a single word, his name, maybe, and tapped his chest. Tahoe. She nodded, managing to whisper her own name in return. Clara. He smiled. A small thing. Then turned and followed the others back into the trees. That night, Clara lit the candle. Not for light, but for hope. The Shoshone had not only given her food and fire, they had given her something she thought was lost with John in the snow, a reason to stay alive. The next morning, Clara woke not to silence, but to the soft crump of footsteps in the snow just outside the cabin. For a moment, she thought it was John. The thought passed quickly like breath on cold glass, but still her heart jumped. She sat up, blinking, the sleep from her eyes, unsure if she dreamed it. Then, again, crump. Crump. Crunch. She rose and moved to the window. The frost had returned overnight, feathering across the glass, but through a gap she could see movement, figures, faint and blurred by the morning mist. The Shoshone had come back. She opened the door, this time without hesitation. There were 4 of them today, Tahoe among them. He carried a bundle of firewood on his back and gave her a small nod when their eyes met. The older woman from before, whom Clara had started to think of as a mother figure, though she did not know her name, stepped forward and placed a hand gently on Clara's shoulder. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The wood was stacked neatly beside the cabin. A new bundle of food was placed near the threshold. Dried meat, something like pemmican, and what looked like a root vegetable. A water skin too slightly warm, as if filled recently with boiled snow. Clara watched them work, unsure of what to do. She wasn't used to being helped. She wasn't used to being seen. Tahoe motioned toward the clearing just beyond the trees, then to the sky clear, blue, bright. He spoke a few soft words she didn't understand, but then pointed back to the cabin and made a sweeping gesture. With his arms, he was inviting her outside. Not to wander far, just to move, to breathe, to rejoin the world. Clara hesitated, then stepped out, drawing her scarf tighter around her face. The cold bit at her cheeks, but she followed him. It felt like learning to walk again. They stopped in a small clearing ringed by pine trees. The air here felt different, open, still, sacred somehow. The older woman had brought a satchel and now began to unpack small items. Feathers, painted stones, dried herbs tied in twine. She moved slowly, intentionally, creating a circle in the column. Snow and placing the objects in it. Clara stood near Tahoe, confused but respectful. The woman gestured for Clara to come forward, then pointed to a flat stone at the center of the circle. Clara stepped into the circle and knelt at the stone. And then she understood. They were giving her space to mourn, to release. She didn't know the Shoshone words spoken. They were low and rhythmic, like wind passing through branches, but she felt every syllable. The woman began to sing a soft, haunting sound that seemed to carry Clara's pain into the air, higher and higher until it dissolved with the breeze. Clara pulled the wedding ring from her pocket, the one she'd taken from John's frozen hand, and placed it on the stone. Her lips parted, and for the first time since she'd found him, she cried. Not just tears, but sobs. Raw, broken sobs that shook her chest and brought her to the ground. No one interrupted. No one turned away. Tahoe knelt beside her, his presence steady but not overbearing. He didn't touch her. He didn't try to stop the storm inside her. He simply knelt there, quiet and unshaken, like the mountains behind them. When the tears had slowed, Clara looked up at the blue sky through the trees. It was so vast, so achingly beautiful. She felt small and empty and somehow lighter. Ceremony ended in silence. The ring was left on the stone. The Shoshone turned to leave, but Tahoe stayed behind. He pointed back toward the cabin and then placed his hand over his heart. "Tomorrow," he said, in careful, accented English. Then he turned and walked away. Clara stood alone for a long time in the circle. For the first time in weeks, she felt something in her chest other than grief. Something she couldn't name yet. Not peace. Not quite, but maybe something on the way to peace. The next morning, Clara waited by the door. She wasn't sure what she expected, maybe another bundle of firewood, maybe silence again. But when she opened the door, the snow was glowing in soft morning light, and the air carried the scent of pine, wood smoke, and something warm. Familiar. Tahoe stood at the edge of the tree line, not far from where the snow began to slope into the forest. He wasn't alone. Beside him, the older woman held a clay pot wrapped in hide. A younger girl, barely more than a child, walked with him, carrying a small pouch and something that looked like a folded piece of leather. Clara stepped out to meet them, pulling John's coat tightly around her. She felt strangely self-conscious, aware of her hair, matted and tangled, her skin rough from cold and grief. But if they noticed, they gave no sign. Tahoe greeted her with a slight bow of his head. The others smiled with a warmth that made Clara's throat tighten. Then they motioned for her to follow. She did, uncertain but trusting now. It wasn't far, maybe a 10-minute walk to a sheltered spot in the woods, where the snow had been cleared and a fire already crackled. A frame made of young saplings formed a simple windbreak, and over the fire was a kettle she hadn't noticed before. The woman offered the clay pot to Clara. She opened it carefully and inhaled the rich scent of stew rabbit, maybe with herbs, and root vegetables, real food, cooked food. Her hands trembled. Clara looked up, unsure if she should take it. She'd done nothing to deserve this. But the woman simply nodded once, firmly. "Eat," Tahoe said gently. The first spoonful brought tears to Clara's eyes. Not from the heat, though it warmed her down to her bones, but because it reminded her she was still alive. She'd forgotten what it felt like to want something. To savor it as she ate, the girl brought her the folded leather it opened into, a pouch containing soft, cured hides and sinew cord. She motioned toward Clara's hands, then mimed sewing. A gift, a gentle invitation. Create if you want to, use your hands. Return to the world of the living. Clara smiled small, but real. She nodded, grateful, though no words came out. Later, as they sat by the fire, Tahoe spoke. "You alone long time," he said slowly, choosing his words. "Hard season," Clara nodded. Her voice cracked when she answered, "Yes." He paused, as though weighing whether to say what was on his mind. Then, "Snow take many. Every year. But you still here, still here." The words landed heavily. She hadn't felt like she was not fully. But something in the way he said it made her believe she'd done more than survive. She'd endured. She'd been seen. "You strong." He added, tapping his chest lightly. Clara didn't feel strong. But maybe strength wasn't always loud or bold. Maybe it was quiet. Maybe it was simply not giving up, even when every reason to do so had gone cold and still in the snow. As they walked back toward the cabin, Tahoe pointed out the signs of wildlife along the trail, rabbit prints where the snow had melted and refrozen in a shape he called ghost path. He explained haltingly how the Shoshone followed the animals' movements to predict the weather. Clara listened, drawn in by the softness of his voice and the knowledge he carried so effortlessly. Before they left, Tahoe handed her a bundle of kindling and a small pouch of herbs. "For fire and sleep," he said. "Boil water. Smell. Is strong but good." Clara took it carefully, feeling again that mix of gratitude and disbelief. These people had no reason to help her. She was not their kin, not even of their world. Yet they had returned again and again, not just with supplies, but with presence, patience, care. "Why are you helping me?" she asked quietly. Tahoe looked at her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he answered with a small shrug. "Because winter is long," he said, "and no one should face it alone." Clara watched them disappear into the trees again, the snow swallowing their tracks behind them. That night, she boiled the herbs in the pot they'd given her. The scent was strong, earthy, unfamiliar but calming. She drank the brew slowly, wrapped in blankets near the fire, and when she finally lay down, the weight in her chest eased. Just a little. For the first time since John left, she slept without fear. Winter did not ease. If anything, it deepened out. The snow piled higher. The nights grew longer. And yet, somehow, Clara no longer felt buried beneath it. The Shoshone came often. Now sometimes every 2 or 3 days, never all at once. Sometimes it was only Tahoe carrying fresh kindling and dried meat over his shoulder. Other times it was the older woman and the quiet girl, bringing herbs and animal hides or trading small gestures of care that needed no translation. Clara began to look forward to their visits not out of need, but out of something deeper. A sense of connection, a rhythm. In their presence, the grief that once filled every inch of her cabin seemed to soften, to make space for other things. Each visit, Tahoe stayed a little longer. He'd help her carry water from the icy stream nearby or repair cracks in the cabin wall. He taught her to identify useful plants that still grew under the snow's crust and showed her how to cut kindling more efficiently with the smaller hatchet he loaned her. He didn't hover. He never presumed. But his steady presence filled the air like warmth from a fire. One afternoon, as they worked side by side repairing the latch on the cabin door, Clara spoke without thinking, John never could get this latch. Right, she murmured, half to herself. Tahoe paused, hands still on the wood. He didn't look away. Your man? Clara nodded, brushing a stray curl from her cheek. He built this cabin. With his own hands. Tahoe studied the door for a moment, then nodded respectfully. Strong man, Clara smiled faintly. Yes. He was stubborn too. Tahoe chuckled softly. You also stubborn, he said with a teasing glance. Clara laughed. The sound surprised her. It was the first real laugh since John died. That night, Tahoe brought her a small piece of carved bone, a simple figure shaped like a rabbit with delicate etchings along the back. He placed it in her hand without ceremony. For you? He said. Lucky. Clara turned the figure over in her fingers, marveling at the tiny detail. Did you make this? Tahoe nodded, then looked toward the woods. When I was boy. My uncle say rabbit is clever, fast, but not just fast wise. Rabbit don't fight storm. Rabbit finds a way through it. Clara looked up at him, something warm stirring in her chest. Thank you, she whispered. They sat in silence for a while. Near the fire. He didn't ask questions. He didn't try to explain the world to her or ease her sadness with platitudes. He just sat with her, listened when she spoke, smiled when she smiled, gave her space when she needed it, and she began to realize something slowly, carefully. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was healing. Their connection deepened in ways that defied language. Clara began learning Shoshone words slowly, awkwardly at first. Fire, snow, friend. Tahoe corrected her gently, sometimes laughing at her pronunciations, but always with kindness. She, in turn, taught him words in English. Sky, hope, safe. One day, he arrived with a gift unlike any she'd received. A hand-stitched pair of moccasins made from supple hide and lined with rabbit fur. On the top of each one was a small embroidered design, sunbursts, carefully sewn in red and gold thread. For walking, he said. When spring comes, Clara held them close, tears stinging her eyes. It wasn't just the gift. It was the message behind it. You will walk again. You will live. She looked at him and whispered, Why are you so kind to me? Tahoe tilted his head slightly, then gave her the smallest smile. Because you are still here, he said, and so am I. It wasn't a love story, not yet. What grew between them was something gentler, more patient. A steady trust that filled the empty places grief had hollowed out. A bond forged in silence. Snow and the quiet, persistent rhythm of two lives beginning to intertwine. As the days inched toward spring, Clara found herself watching the woods not with dread, but with anticipation, not because she needed Tahoe to come, but because she wanted him to. Spring was still far off, but the light had begun to change. The days stretched a little longer now, each one carrying the faint promise of thaw. Icicles dripped slowly from the eaves of the cabin. The snow didn't fall quite as often. In the still silver mornings, Clara sometimes opened her door and stood quietly, listening not for danger, but for the gentle hush of a world waking up again. Inside, she had transformed her space. It no longer felt like a tomb. Blankets gifted by the Shoshone now hung across the walls, keeping in warmth and softening the wooden interior. A bundle of dried herbs dangled from the rafters, their scent calming her nerves. Her own hands had crafted small pouches, stitched from hide, and she'd begun storing food and medicine in them, supplies she had helped gather herself. For the first time since John's death, the cabin felt like a place for the living. She was not alone in her healing. The older Shoshone woman, whom Clara now knew as Moa, had taken to visiting more frequently. She spoke little English, and Clara's Shoshone was limited, but they communicated in the old way, with hands, expressions, and a shared understanding that didn't need words. Moa began teaching her how to grind herbs for salves and poultices, how to steep teas to calm the mind, how to read the shape of smoke to predict weather. Clara absorbed it all, hungry not just to survive, but to understand, to connect. One morning, Clara woke with a resolve in her chest. It had been weighing on her for weeks. She had never properly buried John. Yes, she had found his body and wept over it, but she hadn't said goodbye. Not truly. The snow had claimed him where he fell. She had marked the spot in her mind but had never returned. She mentioned it to Tahoe when he came that afternoon with a bundle of fresh fish. His expression grew serious. He paused, then nodded once. "Tomorrow," he said. "We go." The next morning was bright and windless. Mohak came too, and the young girl Sani, who always smiled with her eyes and had taken to walking beside Clara like a little sister. The group moved slowly through the forest, the snow crunching beneath their feet. Clara held a small bundle, wrapped in cloth inside, John's wedding ring, the carving knife he'd always carried, and a piece of folded paper with the vows she had rewritten by candlelight. They reached the place by midday. The tree was still there, half buried in snow. The bank was frozen, but the shape of where John had fallen remained, a shallow impression preserved in ice. Clara knelt there. The others stood back, giving her space. "I'm sorry it took me so long," she whispered. "You were brave. You tried to save us." "You did." Her hands trembled as she placed the bundle on the snow. She closed her eyes, and for the first time didn't see him frozen and lifeless. Instead, she saw him laughing, chopping wood with sweat on his brow, kissing her forehead while soup boiled over the fire. She saw his eyes in summer light, not winter shadow. "I loved you," she said softly, "and I always will, but I'm still here. And I think I'm supposed to be." She stood, tears drying in the cold wind. Moa stepped forward then, reaching into her satchel. She pulled out a small pouch of red ochre and gestured. Clara nodded. Together, they sprinkled it over the gravesite, a sacred color, a sign of respect, of passage. Tahoe placed a stone marker near the tree, etching a simple symbol into it, a spiral journey. They stood in silence for a while. And then they walked back. That night, by the fire, Clara didn't feel hollow. She didn't feel broken. She felt whole. Somehow. Not untouched by grief, but no longer consumed by it. Tahoe handed her a cup of pine tea. Their fingers brushed. He didn't speak. Neither did she. But something passed between them in that moment, a quiet knowing. Healing was not a line. It was a circle. It came and went like the seasons, but she was no longer lost in it. She was walking it, one step at a time, surrounded by those who expected nothing, but gave everything. Strangers, once, but no longer. By the time the first snowmelt trickled down the slopes, Clara had forgotten what it felt like to be in a hurry. Life with the Shoshone was measured in rhythms, not clock, sunlight, warming bark, animals returning to the forest, water dripping from the trees in slow, steady streams. The long grip of winter had finally loosened, and in its place came birdsong, new buds on the trees, and the scent of damp earth breaking through the snow. Clara now moved with a quiet strength. Her cheeks were sun-kissed, her hair braided loosely down her back. She wore a cloak made of stitched hides, a gift from Moasand, walked confidently through the forest trails, moccasins soft against the thawing ground. She had learned more Shoshone words, but more than that, she had learned their way of moving through the world, attentive, respectful, deliberate, and yet not everything could remain untouched by the outside. One morning, as Clara tended a stew, bubbling over her fire, she heard a sound she hadn't heard in months, a voice shouting in English. "Hello, anyone there?" "You in the cabin." Her heart jolted. She stepped outside to see two men approaching from the trail that led to Fort Washakie. One wore the navy blue of the U.S. Army. The other was dressed like a scout, with a rifle slung over his shoulder and a long beard thick with dust. "Name's Corporal Green," the soldier said. "We've been making rounds now that the snow's letting up. Heard there was a widow out here alone. You Clara Wilkins?" "I am," she replied, her voice steadier than she expected. Men exchanged glances. "Well, ma'am, I'm sorry for your loss." Word reached the fort months back, but there wasn't no way to send a party up until now. "Thought maybe we'd find a grave, but here you are." Clara said nothing. She didn't need rescuing. "Not anymore. We've got a wagon headed east in a week. Supplies, medicine, all of that. If you're looking to return to Missouri or even just down to Lander, we can make space for you. It's a long ride back, but safer than staying alone out here." She looked past them toward the trees. Tahoe stood there. He hadn't approached. He remained where the forest met the clearing, his expression unreadable. Watching. The corporal followed her gaze and frowned slightly. "You've been in contact with the Shoshone, I take it." "I've been alive because of them," she replied firmly. "Well, that's something, I guess." The scout muttered. Clara said she needed time to think. The men nodded, tipped their hats, and said they'd return in 2 days for her decision. That night, Clara couldn't sleep. Her mind wrestled with possibilities. The idea of going back east felt foreign now. What would she return to? A world that had already buried her once? In Missouri, she would be the widow spoken of in whispers. Offered pity, but no purpose. She could return to a society that would try to fix her, redefine her, put her in black for a year and expect her to move on politely. Here. Among the Shoshone, no one asked her to forget John. They had helped her carry her grief without trying to erase it. They had made space for her sorrow and her strength. And then there was Tahoe. She'd never dared name what was blooming between them. It wasn't quick or loud, like her romance with John had been. It was slower, deep-rooted, patient. But it was real. When he looked at her, she felt like a person again. Not a tragedy, not a guest. A woman. At dawn, she found him sitting by the river. "I could go," she said. "They'd take me." He nodded slowly. "Yes." She waited, but he said nothing. "Else, would you want me to stay?" she asked. His eyes met hers, and for the first time there was uncertainty in them. "I cannot ask, but do you want me to?" Tahoe looked at her for a long moment, then reached into the pouch at his side. He pulled out something wrapped in buckskin and placed it in her hands. Inside was a small, hand-carved pendant. Spiral like the one he'd carved into John's stone. "This is for walking forward," he said softly, "not backward." Tears burned behind her eyes. She didn't speak. She only nodded. And that was enough. Clara didn't go with the wagon. When the corporal returned 2 days later, he found her standing at the edge of the clearing, dressed not in black mourning clothes, but in the soft, sturdy garb the Shoshone had taught her to make. She offered him a kind smile and a firm shake of the head. "No, thank you," she said. "I belong here now." The soldier blinked, clearly unsure how to respond. Eventually, he gave a slow, respectful nod. "You're a tough woman, Mrs. Wilkins." "No," she corrected gently. "Just a different one than I was." After they left, Clara felt no fear. No doubt. Just clarity, like stepping into light after too long in shadow. In the days that followed, she resumed her quiet life, but something in her had shifted. She wasn't just surviving the wilderness anymore, she was a part of it. Her grief no longer held her in place. It had become a part of her, but not the whole. She didn't see Tahoe for 3 days after the wagon left. At first, she thought perhaps she'd misread something, that he hadn't wanted her to stay, or that he hadn't hoped. But then, on the 4th morning, she found something waiting at the base of the tree just outside her door. a bundle wrapped in hide and tied with a leather cord. She knelt, heart fluttering, and opened it. Inside was a necklace made from polished bone, shaped beads, and at the center, a carving she recognized. The rabbit he had once given her in winter, now attached to a strand that shimmered with care. Below it, a smaller spiral, like the one from John's grave marker. Woven together not, one replacing the other, but joined. A journey continuing. There was no note. Just a single pine needle tucked into the twine symbol. She would later learn, for quiet strength and new beginnings. She turned toward the woods and saw him then Tahoe. Waiting a few yards back, Clara stepped forward. He didn't speak. Neither did she. Instead, she reached out, took his hand, and placed the necklace gently over her head, letting it rest just above her heart dot, and then she smiled. That spring passed in slow, golden days. Clara spent more time with the village, not just as a visitor, but as one of them. The children began to greet her with playful shouts, bringing her trinkets or asking for stories in broken English. She taught them a few songs from her childhood, and in return, they taught her how to braid feathers into her hair and carve with stone tools. She helped plant early crops, gathered herbs with moa, and even accompanied a hunting party once carrying supplies, learning the landscape, seeing. With new eyes in quiet moments, she and Tahoe would sit together beneath the trees. He never pushed her, never asked for anything she wasn't ready to give. But she began to lean into him, rest her head on his shoulder, trace his fingers when they sat in silence. There was something sacred in the pace they moved at. No rush, just trust. One night, as the fire crackled and the stars blinked above them, Clara spoke the words she'd been holding for weeks. I thought love had to burn hot and bright, like a fire that roars, she whispered. But this with you? It's more like coals, quiet, steady. It doesn't flash, but it doesn't go out. Tahoe looked at her, then reached into the pouch at his side. He pulled out a small stone, smoothed by water and time. On it, etched carefully, was a symbol she recognized. 2 spirals, side by side, linked by a single line. We walk the same path now, he said. Clara touched the stone and not a dot. She didn't compare him to John anymore. Love wasn't a competition, or a replacement. John had been her first chapter, her beginning. But Tahoe was her continuation. Her proof that love, like spring, could return after the longest, coldest winter. And when it did, it brought life. By the time the snow had fully melted, the land was a new thing. Where ice and silence had ruled for months, now came warmth and color. Wildflowers bursting up in soft purples and bright yellows, streams singing over stones, pine trees sighing under fresh sun. Spring had arrived not in a single moment, but in hundreds of quiet ones, just like Clara's healing. And just like her love for Tahoe. Clara stood outside her cabin one morning, looking at the place that had once felt like a coffin and now felt like something else entirely, a starting point. The walls still bore the marks of a harsh winter, but she no longer saw them as signs of failure. She saw strength in every cracked board, every knot in the wood John had once carved. She had grieved here. She had broken here. But she had also survived here. Still, it was time to move forward. Tahoe had offered, gently, without pressure. If you wish, there is a place near the river. Our people would welcome you. No need to stay alone, Clara had nodded. Not as an escape from the past, but as a step into something new. So they worked together side by side, day by day, building a new lodge near the Shoshone village. It was not just a place to sleep, but a home built with care, with warmth, with shared effort. The walls were made of pine and willow, the roof thatched in layers of bark and hide. Clara carved her own shelf into the wall and laid her rabbit pendant there every night, next to the stone with the twin spirals. In the mornings, she woke to Laughter, children running between tents, elders tending early fires, Tahoe humming a tune as he sharpened his tools. Life didn't just continue here. It flourished. Clara learned more of the language, enough to follow stories told around the fire and even to laugh at the jokes. Her hands grew stronger skinning fish, tanning hides, weaving baskets. She taught the village women how to mend worn shirts with thread and needle, how to patch up worn boots with careful stitching. She brought a piece of her old world with her, and it was accepted not as better, not as strange, but as hers. Tahoe never asked for marriage in the way Clara once imagined proposals should happen. There was no ring, no kneeling, no speeches. One night, as they sat together beneath the stars, he simply said, "You are my home." Clara smiled and rested her head against him. "And you are mine." That was all. No one in the village asked questions. They simply began calling her Tahoe's woman, then one of us. It was a quiet adoption, wrapped in acts of kindness, nods of approval, bowls of stew handed to her first at gatherings. One summer day, Mohe approached her with a small pouch and pressed it into her hand. Inside was a carved wooden bead and a few strands of gray hair bound in leather cord. "From my mother," Moa said in slow, deliberate English. "She gave this to me when I joined with my husband. Now, I give it to you." Clara blinked. Fast, overwhelmed. It was more than a gesture. It was belonging. She visited John's grave once more before winter returned. Tahoe walked with her, a quiet guardian as always. They stood together beneath the tree, where snow had once hidden everything. Now there was only golden light. Clara knelt and placed a small pine carving beside the stone. Another rabbit, this one with 2 spirals on its back. "I carry you with me," she whispered, "but I don't walk in your shadow anymore." As they walked away, she didn't feel pulled backward, just peaceful. Clara had come to the frontier expecting hardship. She had found it and more. Loss, yes, devastation, but also the unexpected, community, dignity, compassion, and a love that didn't try to replace what was lost, only build something new beside it. She was no longer a widow clinging to a cabin full of ghosts. She was a woman of the mountains, the rivers, the forests. A woman of 2 stories woven into one of fire and snow, of grief and rebirth, of love found not in the place she started, but in the place she never expected to stay.